So it starts off with voluntary action in a home that was an old school building along Leek Road, and it was a city council building. But they decided they wanted to vacate that building and flatten it and make it a development site. So I was then the treasurer, and we were looking for a new home. The chief executive was a guy called Mark Forrester. And I think the next, in parallel to this site, Ian, perhaps you could talk about that.
Well, the manufacturing stopped on this site in, I think, around 1986. And as a ceramic company, we used it for predominantly storage whilst trying to find a useful purpose for the future of the site. We tried a number of projects, one in particular that was a series of workshops for craft people. But the biggest stumbling block actually at that time was no car parking, because the car park on the Marsh Street side, it's not Marsh Street, whatever it is, but the lower end of the site was pretty small, and that was the only parking on site. And at that stage, the city requirement was that all businesses in the city had to park in public car parks, which was never going to work for a visitor attraction like craft units. So the first I knew about this project was when I think two of the then voluntary action trustees had been to David Carr, who was chairing the single regeneration budget number 2, I think it was, SRB2.
SRB2, yeah.
Which was focused on the Cobridge Hanley area. And so they, the two trustees from voluntary action, Graham Hill and Tony Swift, had a conversation with...
Well, and myself, I was involved in that, yes.
So the three trustees had a conversation with David Carr from a regeneration budget point of view, and is there somewhere where there might be a future home for... So the discussion that David invited me for lunch, which is never you know, it's not going to be a free lunch, and said, you know, we're just interested. I'm interested in what you're able, what's happening at the Hope Street site. He was the company's architect anyway, so he was aware of the location and the layout, and that's where the discussion all started about whether or not there was a project here to build a new home effectively for voluntary action, but at the same time make it self-supporting in terms of renting out the remainder of the space. That it needed some pump priming monies, and that came from I think match funding from our company and from City Council, and on top of that was a donation of the site, which from a Dudson perspective was attractive because it maintained a link with our heritage. This was the original, almost the very start of the business, nearly 200 years earlier at that time. And it also provided an ongoing link to as a visitor attraction for certainly all of our customers who came from all over the world to Stoke-on-Trent. We always made sure that they saw a bit of the heritage and the bottle oven. So that's where it all started. And then it was a case of putting together a cocktail of other funding to make up the other 50% of the cost, initial cost.
And I think alongside that, there was also a lot of professional advice that was needed to go into that in terms of how the funding would work, how the VAT would work, which became a really complex area. And the other connection I had with the Dudson site was that I was also a partner with KPMG at the time, and Dudson were a client. So again, I'd done the audits of this, so I knew the site. So there were further connections in that respect. And KPMG provided some of the specialists in terms of Mike Prince doing some of the business plans, Gareth Harris, who was the VAT genius, coming and giving some fantastic, very advantageous in the end VAT advice. And so again, that sort of, there was a coming together of various professionals as well as the inputs from Voluntary Action and from the Dudson family and family trust.
At that stage, on the one hand, to raise sufficient funds there would have been a much cheaper way of redeveloping the site to have demolished all the old, without doubt. But then that wasn't really what the overall objective was. But by the same token, to unlock heritage funding, we had a significant bid put in for Heritage Lottery that was unsuccessful. And unsuccessful after we'd been asked to amend the designs and keep a lot more of the old than we had originally intended to. So what you see now was not what the original plan was. The original plan was to actually convert some more of the old, and ultimately we did. But the decision, when the Heritage Lottery people expressed what they would need to see before they could approve the bid, we took that on board, submitted the bid and we were then turned down by one individual who basically didn't like the juxtaposition of the old and the new, particularly on the frontage, which everybody else said was fairly genius from the architect's perspective, because it highlighted one by the other, and actually it drew your eye to the heritage. So we could never really quite understand that, but that added about a further $500,000 cost, which at the end of the day, so that was a big challenge because we hadn't got funding for that. The other challenge, as Mark's alluded to, was how it was then going to operate from within. We had a huge amount of help from the city, and particularly from the then chief executive, who played an instrumental role as well, didn't he? Because he got very, very directly involved in this project, which probably wouldn't have happened without that sort of approach. But looking back, it's probably the only project within the single remediation budget, or certainly SRB2, that has survived for 25 years.
I mean, at the time, it was regarded as the flagship part of that SRB bid, which I think was one of the reasons why the city were very supportive of it. But I mean, it's interesting when you ask the question, the first thing that sprang to mind was the fact that it was a listed building, effectively. And once you have a listed building and you want to do something with it, that's a challenge for anybody. But as Ian's pointed out, then there were further complications in terms of this was a complex building, and also, you've got it was regarded as being the gateway to the city, if you like, because when you come down from Kirby Rank, this is the first part of Hanley. So how did you maintain that looking industrial, but also as an iconic symbol?
And of course, at that time, the Eastern Bypass was either just completed or And the plan was for that to become a ring with the western bypass. So effectively, this was in a very prime position, just on the edge of the entire ring road that was going to circle Hanley. That never ultimately happened, but that was what the drawing board looked like at the time. Was that that dual carriageway would continue around on the western side.
I guess the other one other challenge, in a sense, which Ian's alluded to, was the vision wasn't just to revive this and keep the architecture, etc., and provide a home for voluntary action, who were going to be the, if you like, the anchor tenant, but also to provide below market rent accommodation for other voluntary organisations, and that was, you know, it would have been relatively easy to make this a more commercial, you know, with, you see in a lot of cities where they convert them into big offices and bring businesses in, but there was always a fundamental idea to make this also a core for and a whole voluntary centre, which again it has proven to be not just successful but enduring and sustainable. Which I think in the early years we were all very nervous that it would be sustainable, but it has proven to be.
Yeah, and there are many examples, aren't there, of tenants. As Mark said, the idea was to help a charity move from premises in their garage at home to being able to support themselves, their own premises. And there have been several examples of small organisations that came in here and then moved out to, and on occasions, organisations who didn't want to move out but ever wanted to take more and more space here, and we ultimately would have to say to them, sorry, this is not, you know, we can't let you effectively lease the rest of the building, so we're going to have to find, because the objectives of the Dudson Centre Trust were to maintain the heritage, but at the same time for the benefit of particularly the voluntary sector. And that has proved to be very sustainable, and there haven't been it shortly after then became, I don't know how much of this was part of the original thinking, but it was certainly the thinking when we were first talking about cafe on site, was to try and create an atmosphere on site that was more unique to the normal. You know, if you wanted to go and see a bereavement charity, was normally a fairly depressing exercise, because you were moving into premises of an organisation that was going to talk to you at your lowest ebb, sort of thing. And we quickly realised that there was an opportunity here to blend that with people who were coming to the site for other reasons, whether that was to use the cafe or whether it was to visit the museum. But actually it made it an attractive location for organisations that were helping people in disadvantage, because there was a completely different atmosphere on site than there might be in a conglomeration of charities purely delivering the same sort of services. So that we quickly realised, and there was another whole story about the running of the cafe, but until we ultimately decided to take it in-house.
And going back to the original question, of course, one of the other challenges when this was up and running is the bottle kiln housed the Dudson Museum. And, you know, bottle kilns were not designed to be waterproof, because they always had fires in the bottom. That's my simple layman's version of it. And so that has been an ongoing challenge, and still probably is, of maintaining a fantastic space when you go in there, not just because of the collection, but the whole atmosphere and the way it's been designed is superb, but keeping it dry and keeping all what's in it dry. And again, although it's been challenging, it's been successful with both VAST and the Dudson Centre trustees working together to keep that alive.
Well, he couldn't say goodbye to it. It was listed.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, somebody could have come in with a JCB overnight, but then somebody would have been in court sometime later because demolishing it was just not an option.
Mm.
So it was either to do what too many other people in the city have done and simply walk away from the premises completely and let them fall down, where there's without anybody being ultimately responsible, or to develop it in a way that you could, the challenge was to put a useful purpose to a building. Ironically, that kiln never fired, and it's only the outside, the internal hovel, the working bit of a kiln does not exist, and didn't exist because when the kiln was being built for expansion was just at the time where new forms of gas and electric kilns were being developed. And so the expansion that was planned on site came, but it came in a different form of firing. So for the company, that kiln had always been used as, well, twofold: storage of packing materials on the upper floor, and down below it was affectionately known as the circus because of its round shape and ware in different stages of ceramic ware in different stages of production used to come in there and be held and then go out to a decorating shop or whatever, because it was effectively the centre of the site, and there were several doors in the bottom of the so it was simply the fact that any development on site had to include the bottle oven in its current state. But as Mark says, it was designed to keep heat in and not water out. It didn't matter if it wasn't actually the kiln itself. So inside the central area that you could walk around, the walls of the structure that exists now, it would have been very warm anyway, because most of the time there was native coal being burnt in the. So it was where the firemen worked to stock all the fires around to raise the heat in the inner hovel, where the ware itself was being fired.
But I think, as it happens, it does add a huge amount of character. And when people come here, I brought my two grandchildren here to do a little historical interview with, about 18 months ago. And my then 12-year-old grandson and the small one were absolutely blown away by the whole thing. And that's what, when you're working in that sort of environment, you can look out on something that is iconic. It does give you a good feeling. And so it's become a real asset to the site from a, not necessarily, well, obviously it houses the museum, but also from a feel-good factor.
The nature of a Victorian pottery factory was always, they were all very similar in that they were all made up of a number of small rooms. So but by their very nature, they redevelopment lent itself to a series of different units. And that was really, it was that need that I suppose drove thoughts for redevelopment in that sort of way, whether it was a series of workshops or whether it was a series of small offices. It was effectively the layout of a Victorian pottery factory that was nothing unusual about this site compared to hundreds of others in the city at that time. It's just there aren't many left that haven't been flattened and redeveloped or whatever.
The irony being, of course, those models of small rooms and all on different levels were not the ideal way. And if you were building a modern pottery factory, you'd put it all on one level.
Yeah.
So there's a somewhat irony of something that was perhaps not the best from an industrial point of view became ideal, as it says, for
and it was ideal in Victorian times because there was no automation. But there was a cup making unit here. This site only ever produced hollowware, so cups and hollowware. didn't produce flatware at all. And in the days, there was a partnership between the Dudson company and the Ridgway company, and Ridgway's produced all the flatware, and Dudson produced all the cups and sold, cross-sold between the two. Looking back on it, very efficient way of doing it, in that you set up factories to just specialize on one particular set of items. But it got to a stage here in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, where there was a cup making unit that went through 3 different buildings because it started at one end and then with a conveyor belt, but it needed the 3 of them to be knocked together effectively to fit it in. So it just became impossible for a modern manufacturing location, far too restrictive, because it needed to be a big open space, even if it was on more than one level.
One of the key profitability factors for any pottery is don't break them once you've made them, but the more you move them about, the more you're going to break them.
Yeah, so, true. In terms of manufacturing, this is where the process all started. So the raw materials came in effectively where this gate area is now, and this building in front of us was the slip house. So this is where all the raw materials were formulated into the various bodies that were made, and most of the external buildings on this elevation, so the west, the south, and the east, have not really been changed in terms of their overall footprint. Is the same, and there's not been a huge amount of additional. But one of the calculations that was done early on was the realization that if this was going to be commercially successful at a lower than average rental, there needed to be a minimum amount of space available, and in reality there wasn't. So that was when the discussion started about the northern elevation, which prior to that was just 2 stories. On the ground floor it was decorating shops, and on the top floor it was the offices, and they were I'm sure you've got photographs of what that frontage used to look like, but that was the one big development bit that put the offices on effectively another story, but a new structure, effectively creating an envelope for the existing. So that all really that was kept there was the front wall, and everything behind the wall and above it is all new. We had plans to do more development in this in these areas, and you can see 1 or 2 pieces of new where we've linked buildings together. We were going to do a lot more of that, but the one thing that somebody wanted us to retain was all these chimney breasts, or more than we wanted to retain, as I recall. But when you look around, there are an awful lot of chimneys that serve absolutely no purpose today other than heritage. The other big challenge was how to move around between lots of small units. So the other big development bit was the walkways, because there were no walkways in the old, when it was a factory, this walkway system. And that's proved to be one of the more challenging areas for maintenance as well.
To maintain them, yeah.
Because they need,
at times.
Yeah, they have been expensive at times, but equally they're quite unique in linking the various units together. Yeah, there was work. Well, you can sort of see where there were various openings in the brickwork. There was a bridge across to the first old floor, in the old building, and that's where the packaging materials were stored, and then they were taken out into the building. Behind you was the area where the packaging went on and the dispatch. So effectively it was raw materials in here, processing and finished goods out, at this end. And then, though, I think there were at least 3 doors on the ground floor in the bottle oven. At various times, have requested for the bitumen coating that exists on the top of the bottle oven was put on long before it was listed, and it was obviously an attempt to try and keep the packaging materials as dry as possible. And the rest of it didn't matter so much in the rest of the structure, but of course for us in the museum, so there's been a lot of ongoing costs.
It's not aided by the fact that you have to use the lime mortar, which is very difficult if you do it at the wrong time of the year when it's
lime mortar has to dry very slowly. So it's if you speak to any of the old engineers who worked on the canal systems, they will tell you that they never did any repair work during the summertime because they'd end up with a canal lock that would leak, and we have the same issue here. But we're virtually, well, at the moment we're dry.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, I think it's a great, in some ways, it's a great example of the maxim that nothing that's really worthwhile comes easily. And it would have been a lot easier to have developed this site for a different purpose. But whether it would have stood the test of time that this project has done, I doubt, because the fundamentals have remained viable in reality 25 years later, and are still providing the need. So the need for developing charities is there all the time. COVID just reinforced that every time we go through a public funding crisis, there's a clamour for more to be done voluntarily. And so in some respects, there are still too few too few solutions to address that sort of issue.
But I think underneath all of that was the partnerships that were formed. And it wasn't a partnership where one particular partner was pulling the strings. Everybody listened to each other and everybody was sympathetic and been able to bring something to the party. And the sum of the parts ultimately was what enabled us to overcome all the difficulties. Because with the problems there, we had some experience within those 4 or 5 partners, the city council, the professional advisors, voluntary action, obviously the owners of the property in Dudson's, and everybody was working in the same and pulling in the same direction. And that's what I advise. If you are going to put something together complicated, make sure there isn't one person with a different agenda. You've all got to have the same common goal.
And there's no doubt that the way the partnership operates today has been refined, driven by the experiences over those years. So it wasn't, to have the idea that we created the trust and that this was right from the very start. The idea was always that the trust was there to look after the fabric of the outsides of the buildings, in fact, or the buildings themselves, and that the inside bit, in terms of leases and a head lease and then units being sublet from within, without that sort of support from VAST, it never would have. Because the Dudson Centre Trust didn't have that sort of, basically the trustees of the Dudson Centre have been pretty stable for many, many years, and there's never more than half a dozen or so people, but looking to bring expertise in different areas, be that legal or buildings related, surveyor, just to have a cross-section of people But at the end of the day, this is not a commercial exercise. It's a, you know, there's an attempt to, at best, break even.
Well, that remains. I mean,
Yeah.
One of the critical things is right from day one, we've had to set up our plan, because once built and restored, that's fine. But to make it enduring, anybody who's got an old building will know that the ongoing repairs and maintenance are not as simple and have to be funded. So all of that, again, is part of having the right combination of partners and foresight and ability to do that.
But, you know, in answer to your specific question, would we be telling people not to even think about it? No, I don't think we'd be telling them that. But it takes a lot of effort, and as Mark says,
perseverance.
Yeah, it does. And there have been many times where I think we've all individually wondered whether or not, particularly until we got it open, but there were many times when each of us, either individually or collectively, would be saying, hang on a minute, are we really going to get there? But that, in some ways, is, you know, that's when your determination is tested to the full, and we can, looking back, we managed to find a solution to all of the problems one way or another.